Uh, just so you know, I, at this point, am now recording, and you just have to say I approve.
I approve.
Okay. That way, when we send this out, the lawyers won't come for us.
Before David,
I'm going to put up the maps now and then hand it over for Wick to say a few words, and then Dave, you take over.
Great.
it's a real pleasure to have you here, David, because I think your books are just, if you will, English language, stunning studies in operational art. And over the last 20 or so years, as I've read more and more of the German histories coming out, particularly those by the Military History Institute, Klaus Meyer's stuff, and I've come to the conclusion that the Germans really did not understand operational art. From my point of view, I think operational art depends on three critical elements. One is the tactical sharp end, if you will, of fighting. The second, equally important as that in terms of operational art, is logistics. And the third part is intelligence and the capacity to understand your opponent and get some sense not only of his number of buttons that he has, but to get some sense of his real military effectiveness, which has a lot more to do with culture and training and attitudes and preparation for war. And from that respect, the Germans just have a terrible record, because nobody in the Second World War, the major powers, got intelligence worse. And from a logistical point of view, these guys are crazy. These guys are just simply rank amateurs. And I think there's some reasons for that, which we can maybe go into later in our discussions, but their understanding of logistics is just plain appalling. So, David, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And in some ways, that's kind of the perfect lead-in, just because so much of what we're going to be talking about today is, yes, this enormous campaign, but really behind it all is, how do we understand, I think, operations? Because one of the things that would precede my work, and you know, I was probably like a lot of you in that I came at literature as a younger man and tended to just accept what I was presented with. And I think that was one of the big changes when I started doing my doctoral work, is of course at that point you get into the archives and you start looking at the files produced by the German army. The most important point here is scale, I think, because it wasn't as though past historians hadn't done their homework, they just, perhaps you could say, hadn't done enough of it. And the reason they hadn't done enough is because if you look at this Eastern Army, we're talking more than 3 million men. That is an enormous amount of paperwork to have to consume if you're a historian trying to reconstruct these events. And past historians have typically looked at the top level files. And one of the things I can say as a sort of summative comment for all of Barbarossa is, you get a very different picture of the campaign from the high level files, that is to say the high command of the German army and some of the leading men, particularly people like Helder, who is the chief of the army general staff. You get a very different picture from reading their material than when you start to go down. I mean, the army group, and think about that, the size of Barbarossa, that you even have army groups. How many wars have army groups in them? But then the constituent armies, the corps below that, and then the divisions. And particularly Corps Division starts to cast this campaign in a very different light. And you start to realize a lot of the things that Wick just said are so very true of the lower, or you might say middle echelon of the Ostheer, the Eastern Army. These guys are undergoing real operational problems, and they're writing about it, but as that gets reported up the chain, you're not necessarily seeing an engagement with that at this more strategic level. So perhaps the pertinent question to ask at the onset is, well, what are the Germans trying to do here? Because if I imagine a lot of you probably are well read in World War II, at least you have the basic idea. And if anyone knows anything about Barbarossa, it's clearly the Germans who are on the offensive. It's clearly a campaign in which huge Soviet armies are being destroyed. And these kinds of things often inform the impression of who's doing well here. I think that's partly also why past historians have cast this campaign, at least in the summer period, as being not just a German success, but a kind of fantastic success. So people look for German failure in some point after Barbarossa. And it can sound a bit, well, what are you trying to sell us if you're telling us that the Germans aren't doing well, even perhaps losing the war in context of this fantastically successful operation? I think it's the classic military indicators of success. Whoever's going forward, who's destroying the most amount of tanks, taking aircraft, taking prisoners of war. By the end of 1941, they've got more than 3 million Soviet POWs. That seems to tell its own story. But remember the difference for the Soviets and the Germans in terms of what they must achieve in 1941 is very, very different. The Germans are already clearly involved in a war that's going to require very different production lines. They're fighting against a global empire that is a sea power, there's an air war taking place, and there's a small land war taking place in North Africa. Once you open the Eastern Front, I mean, remember, in the Western military districts, the Soviets have about 2.7 million men, and overall in the Soviet Union, they have 5.3. That's before, that's in the other military districts, that's before they tap their 14 million men in mobilization base. So there is a lot of potential for force generation among the Soviets. The Germans, of course, are invading with 3 million men. They've got almost all their motorized and panzer divisions beyond what they've got deployed in North Africa. They've got those on the Eastern Front, but they've got no reserves. They can't reconstitute those because the idea is this is going to be a short, sharp operation that ends in the summer of 41. And as they break through, they think the plan will be encircle the Soviet forces at the border, and then you have exploitation. Largely, the big battles will be border battles. And that's very much what they do. They do encircle large Soviet armies at the border, but they are unable to then end the campaign. Why is that? Because the Soviet system is an echelon system. They have border armies, but as they raise reserves and bring in other forces from the depths of the Soviet Union or the other military districts, they are reconstituting in the western parts of Russia. So that first big encirclement for Army Group centers on Minsk. We call it the Battle of Minsk, but the Battle of Minsk is probably better termed the Battle of Belarus. And if you look at the size of Belarus, that's an enormous place. And it takes place in the first 10 days. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Let me butt in for a second.
Sure.
Bubba or somebody else still has their thing off mute. Can you mute your? Make sure everyone except me, Wick, and David are muted. Never mind. But, you know,
we got it off.
Zoom lets me do it automatically. All right, go ahead, David.
Okay. Yeah, so they're centering their first big encirclement on Minsk. And if you look at the size of that area, it's huge. But the other thing is we have to look at what is the topography here. So Belarus in those times was heavily forested. There's also quite a lot of swampy ground, especially to the south. In fact, we're seeing some of the maps just up there now. Two things are happening there. They can't end the battle just because Hort and Guderian can encircle those Soviet border forces in that first 10 days. That is, yes, the encirclement, they've broken these formations in the sense that they're not getting their supply and the command and control has been broken, but they still exist. They don't have time in that very short period to comb through all the forests and root out all of these Soviet commanders and units. In fact, some of the Soviet units didn't even know that they were encircled. So you then have this odd circumstance at this point. You've got the panzer groups who are a small elite among the German forces. I mean, we're talking about 30 divisions overall in this German invasion force of 150 divisions. Only 30 are the panzer groups. So the vast bulk is infantry divisions. as well as a few security divisions and mountain divisions and so on. But if you look at the difference in terms of how they move, all the motorization is prioritized for the panzer divisions. They've enacted this encirclement. On the surface, it looks like, oh, this is perfect. We're seeing the maps up there. You can see the red is the Soviets that have been encircled. You can see that they've clearly centered this thing on Minsk. And then the exploitation is supposed to begin. Guderian and Hort, they are then driving out into the rest of the Soviet Union. But they have to run logistics. They need their fuel. They need their ammunition. Particularly at this point, fuel is what they're lacking. But all of that has got to come across these very narrow roads that are, we say roads, but there's very little sealed roads in the Soviet Union, so they're often dirt tracks. Those dirt tracks throw up an enormous amount of dust, so you're going to suffer attrition through two means. One, these are 1930s trucks, sometimes 1920s trucks. What are the air filters like on those? And as you drive along, they kick up a lot of dust. That's going into the air filters. These trucks are driving day and sometimes night as well, because it's a very tenuous supply line. They're trying to catch up to those panzer groups. And that means they're suffering attrition just through movement, because the dust is overwhelming the air filters. That means it's getting into the engines. How do you deal with that? Well, I noticed there's a real spike in oil, because what they're trying to do is flush all this dust out by just pumping oil through it. They don't have enough oil. So these kinds of secondary problems have very real implications. The other one that I'm sure you're already aware of is if there's a large number of Soviets moving through this space, then your panzer group spearheads are already in an exploitation phase, and your logistics is running through a very dangerous sector. And where is the protection? Nominally, you would think, well, the infantry divisions would provide that protection, but they're strung out behind, because if they're dependent on horses, there are 600,000 horses in Operation Barbarossa. And how fast does a horse move when it's carrying artillery and field kitchens and all the rest of it? At the speed of a man marching. And that sort of belies the idea we often have of this motorized juggernaut that is the Wehrmacht. That's the Goebbels propaganda films that we watch. That's what they tend to show. But the reality is there are kind of two armies invading in the Soviet Union. That's this motorized elite, and then there's this other side. And there's a real problem, because your tanks are only as good as the ability for them to be supplied. So imagine then from Minsk enacting the second big encirclement that we see, which is taking place in July. So if we get to the 16th of July, that's when Smolensk falls. So again, this Barbarossa timetable seems to be proceeding at this rapid pace. And there's no question. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second. I just want to add something in terms of the, because you raised the truck problem. There's an additional problem, which even if they hadn't had the dust, large numbers of these trucks were going to break down. Underlining all this, the Germans had no understanding of mechanization or motorization, in the sense that having assembled a huge number of different trucks from not only what they built, what they captured from the Czechs and the Poles and the French and the Brits, even getting trucks from Switzerland, they then, instead of trying to assemble a force for each panzer division, which would have a limited number of trucks, on average, the German panzer divisions had 40 different types of trucks. So that even if they hadn't had the dust and those other problems, this was an absolutely insane approach to, if you will, of course, what we're dealing with is no understanding that, in fact, to keep large numbers of vehicles operating, you have to have a supply chain that's going to work, the ability to bring in spare parts, and with something like 1 million different kinds of spare parts necessary to support this truck fleet, and 40 to 50 different kinds of trucks in each panzer division, you can't fix them. They may be only slightly broken, but they are not going to be fixable.
Absolutely right. And that is such a key point. I mean, the logistical nightmare, not just of supplying the panzer groups, but what do you do when something falls out over these terrible roads? And actually, just before this all began, Wick was talking about the fact that, you know, the amount of, we assume things that, you know, these guys all know how to drive. Actually, that's a skill you have to acquire. A lot of men don't have a car because this is, you know, they've grown up in 1930s Germany where there aren't cars for individuals. So, you know, these guys are trying to cope with something that really isn't fit for purpose. And there's another problem. at the point where we are in this campaign, the huge bulk of supplies you would require for 3 million men in the field is actually going to have to come with rail, not with trucks. And the idea for the Germans is, well, that's actually really simple, because you have these rail lines in the east, and yes, it's a wider gauge because it's a bigger scale. So the Soviets built bigger locomotives, a wider gauge, but that's easy. You just knock up the pins, push them closer together, and then knock them down again. So they haven't invested a lot of resources in the railroad troops, as they call them. In other words, just these groups who will go along and convert the rails, and then you can run your normal trains to supply the Ostheer. And in the interim, you can capture some of the Soviet locomotives and continue to run those on the sections you haven't converted. That is extremely optimistic for two reasons. One, the Luftwaffe itself is attacking Soviet train stations and destroying troop trains. That's also destroying the infrastructure. But the Soviets themselves are very effective, perhaps not in the earliest days, but certainly after that, they become much more effective at destroying this heavy infrastructure. And then you have to go back to, well, how well resourced were the railroad troops at building heavy industry? How much capacity do they have for rails, for sleepers, for all of these things, slidings and things you need to run trains in the East? They realized, well, we don't really have that capacity. So the extension of rail into the Soviet Union is much slower than anticipated. Now, what does that mean for the trucks? A truck is really only useful at short distances because they have to go from the railhead to the front line and back again and back again. And as they go further and further, they start to consume their own supplies just to run the truck because they've got to carry their own fuel. And they don't really just drive east-west, east-west. They're often having to go and find the unit, which is on all kinds of bad roads, and it's slow, it's low gears, so lots more fuel consumption. Once you start operating trucks at 200 kilometers, or what is that, 150 miles or something, you can imagine this is becoming very inefficient. So when you start putting a lot of these things together, it just illustrates Wick's point at the beginning. Do the Germans really, we sort of had this idea, oh, they know operational art, you know, tactically, the Wehrmacht is seen to be very good. Operationally, often I used to read back in my day that, oh yeah, they were very good, and strategically that it was problematic. And I think what newer historiography, and not just mine, if you look at some of the other areas in the Second World War, particularly newer studies on the East, you see time and again, do these guys really understand the operational side? And I'm just not convinced. I mean, I'll leave people to make their own choices, but more and more, especially when you get down into the files, you read these core, you read these divisional files, it becomes very apparent to me the Germans don't really understand this, at least at the higher echelons. You read things from divisional commanders and men who are at the coalface, if you will, of doing this, and they write very critical things. This is how, and I have the feeling they understand it. And they're trying almost to explain it up the chain. But, and this is a really great question for thinking about, and for maybe, I don't know if we have a discussion afterwards, but is the question, why is that not resonating with higher echelons? Why is that not getting through? And I don't mind saying, I spent quite some years as I was working on book after book. In the earlier books, it felt to me like, well, this is hubris, right? This is overconfidence. And I would use those words. By the time I got to writing about Operation Typhoon, especially in November, I just felt like that doesn't really cut it anymore. I can't explain it to the reader because it just sounds so weak. The difference between here are your resources and here is your strategic goal is just become so great. It's more than just, oh, they're over optimistic. It's a real block. And the closest I've come to explaining that, and I don't want to preface our discussion, but I think that there is a degree of, I guess what you could say, National Socialist military thinking. And the reason I think that is because there's a whole other war taking place in parallel here. And I think it informs more than you might think the operational, the campaign itself. And what is that? It's the parallel war that really German historians write about a lot more. Germans don't really do operational studies in the way that we in the Anglo-American world do. There's all kinds of cultural reasons, historical reasons. The Nazis did military history, so post-war, that's not really in vogue. But when we look at the War of Annihilation and this huge amount of literature that's largely in German, the Germans do study the Wehrmacht, but they're interested in this Vernichtungskrieg, this War of Annihilation. you start to see a lot of elements that explain that in ideological terms. And I think that's really interesting for us because we kind of assume, the Germans, well, they speak a different language and they obviously have a different culture and a different history, but they're Western in the sense that that's how they present themselves, the German generals in their post-war memoirs. Oh, we were just like you. We were outraged when we found out about the terrible things happening in the rear areas, as though they didn't know. They absolutely knew. In fact, there are criminal orders written by the German army and implemented by the German army. It's probably, I won't go too much into that because we want to keep it on the campaign, but maybe just one example. Some of you may have read Guderian's memoir. It's very popular in the Anglo-American world. I teach at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and a lot of my students say, I read Guderian's, and it's such an interesting book, and he was a good commander. And I often think, well, hang on a second. What is your standard for a good commander? Beyond anything to do with operations, and there are certainly question marks in that space, he tells you quite explicitly that he's outraged with things like the Commissar order, and he never passed that on. Well, there's a fantastic book, actually, I'm just out of reach for it, but by a guy named Felix Römer, so unfortunately not in English, but he did a study of this to the point where he literally spent 2 years in the archive and read everything in 1941-42, so he could come to a categorical conclusion. Who implemented the Commissar order and to what degree? Well, it turns out there are hundreds of cases in Guderian's Panzer Group in all of his corps and divisions. So he definitely passed it on. He definitely knew it was happening. And I think one informs the other in terms of explaining a lot of this, because there is a big gap between, as I say, resources and what the goals are.
David, let me interrupt again, because I think I agree entirely with what you're saying, but there's also, in terms of what I'd call a degree of wishful thinking in terms of the first point, which summed up to me occurred on the 23rd of November, 1941, when the chiefs of staff, including Halder and all the Army group and armies, were meeting and wondering what was going to happen. And the freeze had just set in, so the mud thing was over. And Halder actually says in this meeting that thank God we have the roads are freezing, and now we can move forward. And then he says, and hopefully it will not snow until mid-January. That's a piece of just simply hope. Thinking of the Army Chief of Staff, John Sullivan, who said in the early 90s, hope is not a method. And there is an element in the German military that somehow willpower or ideology will overcome what you quite correctly point out. When there's misfit between means and ends, they just disregard it.
Yeah, it is remarkable. It is so remarkable. I mean, even after years, we should be some way, attuned to this. But I think that's also partly what's going on is, if you're being asked, I'll give you a great example. At the beginning of November, an army that people don't tend to look at much because it's the Second Army, it's sort of in the middle of Russia, so it's at the southern part of Army Group Center. And it's one of the armies in Army Group Center. Army Group Center at this point is driving on Moscow. So it's Operation Typhoon. And the Second Army's order is to drive east. They're not trying to go to Moscow. They're just trying to keep contact with the Army Group South.
David?
Uh-oh. All right, I'm back. Jim, Lacey.
David got stopped.
David's frozen, I know. All right. I'm going to give him a minute or two to get back on.
It's kind of, I know.
There he is.
Say again?
You stopped for about a minute and a half there, so we started talking.
Oh, okay.
But we'll hand it back over to you. Before you do, one of the things that came out, because I started reading about this in high school, and I read Guderian's book, and Guderian was, I don't call any Wehrmacht officer or SS officer a hero, but I thought there was a lot to learn from him in operational warfighting. And the more I read your books, the more I'm like, wow, this guy should have been relieved here, 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 and here. That he was actually one of the people that broke the German offensive. But I'm sure you're going to get to that. But my thinking on Guderian changed radically after reading your books.
I think the other thing with Guderian, one of my students
David,
said
what
to
you
me,
saying? I want to add.
no, go right ahead.
I want to add to Jim's point, which is, to me, you know, one of the things that was emphasized in the 70s and 80s when people got interested in the German army was mission-oriented orders. And I think there are some examples here which take your breath away of mission-oriented orders just simply being completely at variance with what the whole purpose of the offensive is about. And I think the best example of that is the coordination between the 3rd Panzer group and the 2nd Panzer group. When Holt arrives on the 15th of July at the position behind Smolensk with this brilliant drive by the 20th Panzer Division, waiting Guderian's Panzer divisions, and they've gone off to Yelna. And the gap, which is ready to be closed on the 15th of July, does not get closed until the 2nd or 3rd of August. And my guess is that about half of the troops in the Smolensk salient got away simply because Guderian went off and did his own thing without paying any attention to what his orders were. And what's astonishing is that Bach at the top was not capable of going down and sitting in Guderian's headquarters and say, you will do this or you're going to be fired. But mission-oriented orders simply to create a situation of chaos.
Yeah, it just also underscores that scope that an individual German commander, and I mean, I've spent more time on the German army than I have on any other army. So it's you know, it's hard to say to what extent is a commander his own, you know, sort of his own, you know, entity, relatively speaking. But the clear point here is that there is less top-down direction once you get to the army and Panzer group level than you might think. Bock tends to try and facilitate some commanders who are, I mean, Kluge, who is nominally early on the head of something called the 4th Panzer Army. In other words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to make Hort and Guderian work better together by putting an umbrella organization over it. One of the things I think that comes out of that is, you know, how much personal politics plays a role in command, because if you don't respect your commander, and Guderian from already in the French campaign, which some of you may know, doesn't get along with Kluge. But then even if he does, I mean, he gets along on some level with Hort and Bock, at least doesn't hate them, and he really doesn't get along with a lot of other commanders, and he still doesn't coordinate. And some of this stuff seems blindingly obvious. I mean, why, if you've got this wonderful map up there and you can see where the 10th Panzer Division is, why is he out there at Yelna? I mean, in his memoir, he's explaining that as what we have to secure the jumping off positions for the next stage of the offensive. Yeah, but exploitation only comes after you've destroyed the force that you're nominally working on in the Smolensk encirclement. And if they're not encircled and they are escaping, your exploitation hasn't yet begun. But it's also, I think, an indication that these units, these panzer groups, remember what I said at the beginning, there's very little of them, and look at the space that they're operating in. So, you know, Russia is an expanding funnel as you get out into it. At Smolensk, they are still ahead of the infantry. The infantry divisions are under murderous pressure to catch up. Because if you're literally given the order, well, it's 22nd of June, it's the height of summer, you're going to march right through Belarus and get all the way to Smolensk. Smolensk is 550 kilometers from your starting line on dirt roads, and you're very much on dirt roads because the absolute best roads are priority for motorized divisions, so, or the roads for the trucks and so on. So they're often pushed onto side roads. They are catastrophic. And so they're marching over all of this, again, through all the dust. In fact, some of the, you know, the useful studies is, yes, we tend to use all these top-down files. We use top-down files to understand a campaign on this scale. It's also really helpful to read what we call bottom-up files, i.e., you know, soldiers' letters and diaries, because it gives you a very human view of what does that actually mean to be in a campaign like this. And two letters stand out in my mind that I just thought, my God, the pictures you get when you hear these things. One of them said, you know, we're all young men, but at the same time, you get to the end of the day, having marched for 15, 16 hours, sometimes carrying ammunition boxes and things, And you hear words of suicide, the guide wrote. And I thought to myself, words of suicide? In another case, he said, our men collapsed in total exhaustion. The next day, Sergeant who and so had died. And I thought, my God, these guys are young men, because this isn't the point in the German war where they've got 40-year-olds in their infantry. These are nominally young men. And this pace is leading to that conclusion. I mean, not everywhere. By no means do I want to imply that, but it just goes to show how rigorous this campaign is for the infantry. They're doing their absolute best to catch up, and they're still behind. So the panzer groups and the motorized and panzer divisions, which are trying to enact this encirclement, are a finite resource. They're the smaller elite arm. And if you ask the question, once we get past Smolensk, and so we've had the second great encirclement, the border battles should be over. Have they got a sort of a free hand, you might say? Well, actually, no. They've still got a front that goes north to south. They're still presented with, I mean, I don't want to give you the impression that the Soviet forces are all wonderfully equipped and well trained, but they have had military training. This is that mobilization base that they're able to mobilize. And they have actually got resources. The Soviets are still battering into. They are not idle either. One of the impressions we have of 1941 is that the Soviets are always on the defensive. Well, Soviet doctrine is largely offensive. So when the Germans then reach Smolensk and they've finally even had the infantry caught up, we don't see it because we typically follow military campaigns wherever we see the front move. And that can be a real deception, because as the next stage of the campaign goes on, you may already know this, there's going to be a big debate in Army Group Center and indeed with the German High Command. Should they continue on to Moscow? Should they drive further south into the Ukraine? What's going to happen is obviously they're going to go down into the Ukraine. That becomes the Battle of Kiev. But actually, the Soviet forces that are being mustered into these areas west of Moscow are going to begin a major offensive in late August and early September, which is hitting the German 9th Army. Now, normally in Barbarossa, people aren't taking much note of what the 9th Army is doing because it's just a static part of the front. At least you would think that. And they have two problems with this. They have to keep motorized divisions back from Panzer Group 3 in order to facilitate the defense. Because when the Soviets hit them, static infantry divisions can't be quickly moved. There's not good lateral communication, and they just are too slow in order to plug gaps in the line. And that provides another draw on motor.
Can I step in for 1 second?
But it also means, go ahead, yep.
All right. Just to bring a wider scope here, because it's always been an interest to me, that Napoleon and Adolf Hitler both began their invasions of Russia or the Soviet Union on the same day, June 22nd. And this is a break point here for both. David hasn't gone into it so much, but some of these panzer divisions are already at one-third, one-half the strength in their armor that they started with. They definitely were only we're less than a month into the invasion, a full month into the invasion, and they already need to stop and rehabilitate. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about that. But you notice Smolensk is right just past Vibetsk. This is where Napoleon stopped, and his marshals said, "This is it. This is as far as we go this year. You got to stop, build depots, and we'll pick up the march on Moscow in the next campaigning season. The Grand Army is wasted." And Napoleon actually agreed with them and said, "Yeah, well, this is where we stop." And the next day he changed his mind and they continued on. And you all know what the history of that was. As I'm reading what David has written, I'm like, wow, what happens if the German army stops here, rehabilitates, gets ready, digs in, fights off the Soviet winter offensive, and then has a much stronger force in 1942. On the other hand, if you stop the offensive operations, the Russians are going to be a hell of a lot stronger in 1942 either. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm just bringing to our attention here as military officers that even a motorized army culminated at almost the exact same spot that Napoleon did. Or should have culminated.
Let me break in here, Jim, after you, because I want to add some more for David to think about. what you've researched, David, makes it very clear. What Jim just said is absolutely right. The problem is twofold. Is that the Germans at the end of July begin to sense there's a problem, but they do not yet know the full extent of the problem, because it's not to the very end of July and into August that these reserve armies suddenly start whacking into them in huge numbers and almost endless numbers, that they wake up. And you've got on the 11th of August, 1941, that wonderful quote when Halder is told by the idiots in the intelligence section, Lieutenant Colonel Kinzel, which says a lot, that the OKH intelligence section is run by a lieutenant colonel for Russia, that, oh, we've made a mistake. They got 100 more divisions than we thought, or 120 more divisions. And Halder says, basically, oh my God, we have really underestimated the number of divisions they have, but they don't draw the right conclusion because of I would argue, the very same kind of, here it's not just Hitler wants to go on, but the generals want to go on because they can't believe it. And it's a sort of belief that continues right up until December, that, oh, if we only get to Moscow, they're going to collapse. And so reality is seen by the company, platoons, companies, battalions, division commanders, but the higher you go, the less capable the whole system seems to be to understand the consequences of what they've done. I would say, from my point of view, that if they had stopped after Kiev and pulled all the panzer divisions out and waited, they might have done some real damage the next year. But again, of course, they're looking that the U.S. is now about to be in the war, and they're looking at the fact that we don't have any fuel. David, go ahead.
Yeah, no, these are great points. You know, first pick up Jim's idea, and he's right. Maybe of all the things I could emphasize, you know, following up on that, you know, the Panzer divisions are under strength. I mean, by the end of the Battle of Smolensk, so that's the early part of August when they've finally encircled it, but as Wick was saying, a lot of these guys have gotten out before they've managed that. It's not that the 50% of the missing Panzer strength is because the attrition has come from battle. We always imagine that's what happens. In the German files, you see this Total Ausfall, so that basically is totally lost. It means destroyed, essentially. And perhaps that's the figure, to the extent that anyone's ever quoted those figures in that period. I'm not sure that anyone actually has, but then the figures are small. That would give you the impression, oh yeah, the Germans are doing really well. The figure you've really got to look for, though, is the next one, which is to what extent are these units, these tanks, no longer serviceable? In other words, just the sheer attrition of movement, and they're moving all the time because they don't have tank transporters. These tanks have gone under their own power from the border and fighting, you know, they don't just drive east all the time, they're fighting campaign, they're fighting battles, they're going in support of each other. They're constantly moving. So all of this, you know, I talk about the dust, but a lot of other issues that are undermining their serviceability. And that's where they're the huge number. In fact, one of the Panzer divisions by the end of June, the 7th Panzer Division, is reporting 75% losses of their Mark IVs. That's Mark IVs and Mark IIIs are their best tanks. 75% losses, and that's the Battle of Minsk at the early stages. And then you have to ask these secondary questions, a bit like our logistical system. Well, how do they fix a tank in the field? Well, there's another problem. They actually don't have that capacity. They will develop it in the course of the war, but this is a so-called Blitzkrieg timetable, right? I mean, Blitzkrieg is a problematic term, but they've no time to reconstitute these things at the front because they don't have the capacity. Typically, at the end of their campaigns in the Balkans, in France, in Poland, they've transported a lot of these tanks back to the factories because the campaign ends. And that starts to pose problems. Well, you haven't got that option in the East. So you nominally have a lot of tanks, But in actuality, a lot of those tanks are no longer serviceable. You can't use them. So it's a really important point that Jim mentions there. The other thing I might just pick up is, we talk about 1812, just as a quick aside. We always think that the disaster for Napoleon was certainly his retreat. That seems to be what people talk about. But his army, this Grande Armée, it loses most of its men. I think they've only get to Moscow with 100,000. So that is much more than 50% of what they start with. Just again, they fight obviously some very important battles along the way, but they're losing them through the attrition of movement as well. Desertion, men falling out through sickness, foot sores.
David, let me add here. To go back
yep.
a little bit. One of the major problems is that everything the Germans built was built like a BMW, to be as fine a piece of machinery as you could get. And it never strikes in terms of German manufacturing that you would want to build a weapon system that it's easily maintainable and works. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that from the German point of view of war, it's a continental Central European view, which is the battle is going to occur on our frontiers. We can bring anything it breaks down back home. In fact, my understanding is the Panther tank literally could not change its engine in the field. It had to be sent back to the factory, which is, again, compared to the Sherman, if you think of maintainability, it puts the Panther at 0 and the Sherman at about 100. But it is, I think, an argument of the fact that in this land, in terms of invading Russia, the kinds of maintainability that you would get for a BMW or a truck or whatever in Germany, it isn't there. And they have no capacity to take that ability to fix things along.
It's such a good point, because one of the reasons I argue that this campaign is, the turning point, to the extent that anyone wants to try and identify a turning point, is not so much because of, operational factors. I mean, I think we need to see operations in context. The moment your striking power has decreased to a point where you're not going to be able to end this in anything like, not just the Barbarossa timetable, the 6 to 10 weeks that they nominally planned for, but in the course of 1941 at all, then you have to look to secondary factors. And Wicks just hit the nail on the head there. There are much bigger factors that should be informing German military operations that aren't taken into account, like resources, like manpower in factories, like financing for war. And if that is the way in which you construct your wonderful equipment, well, the obvious problem there is it takes a lot more man hours to construct a wonderful tank that can do all kinds of things. Believe it or not, some of the German tanks can go underwater. People don't know that, but they built some that were hermetically sealed, so you could literally drive. Now, that's wonderful to have that option to the extent that you might need it. But you think about your standard T-34. We are talking a lot about the Germans here. Soviet machinery was basic. It was effective, but it was basic. And if this is a war of material, which is what I argue it becomes, after the Battle of Smolensk, my thesis is, yep, you can see the tank levels have shrunk so much, you can see the logistics is under such strain, you can see all kinds of problems, even in the infantry divisions, that the ability for Germany to keep pushing this Eastern Front backwards when the Soviet army is actually getting larger, not smaller. We would think that because 300,000 men are encircled at Minsk and 300,000 at Smolensk and other smaller battles along the front, that the Red Army must be shrinking. And actually that's not the case. They are going to raise 40 armies over the course of 1941. So actually by the end of 1941, the Soviet army has hit 8 million men. Now, that doesn't mean as much as it sounds like. It doesn't mean that, oh, they're now so strong, because a lot of these armies are undermined by the fact that they do not have anything like the officer material you need to be effective. There they are, they're in the field, they function basically, but it helps them a lot that the German offensive strength has been so compromised that they're able to exist in the field without being broken and smashed as quickly as they otherwise might have been. And that gives them time to slowly, and it is a slow process, to learn their roles. And it's learning by doing, and it's learning through massive attrition. but they're not being destroyed as fast as they're being created. And that's an essential point. And again, if they're also being resourced by factories that are churning out very basic material, a T-34, apparently, I've actually never driven in one, but apparently was a horrible ride. Some of the seats were still steel, and, you know, it was obviously cramped and all the rest of it. It didn't have the functionality of a German tank for tank. And that's also the crews. I mean, the German armored doctrine, we all know, is much better, and on all of these things. But in a war of material, you need just material. The Eastern Front is very, very long, and it's like a mulching machine. In fact, there's a wonderful statistic in, I think it's Walter Dunn's book, where he's talking about, and I don't know quite how he got to these figures, but he talks about how long a piece of machinery in the Red Army would, on average, survive. And I think it's something like 40 days for a tank. That tells you two things. One, you're going to need a lot of tanks and a lot of aircraft and a lot of all the other things. But it also means, if that's true, the ability, this explains why the Soviet learning curve in some ways is as slow as it is, because even as you get those units and you put those men in the field, if the tank is being lost, yes, sometimes the crew may survive, but often I imagine they don't survive, and therefore you're starting again each time. I mean, the Western Front, this key front that fights against Army Group Center, is basically reconstituted 2.5 times over the course of Barbarossa and Typhoon, which is astonishing attrition. And I think if we then, you know, go to the next stage of our campaign, it's why when you see in the winter the Soviets on the offensive, part of the problem for the Soviets is, yes, they are pushing the Germans back, but it comes at horrendous cost. It's 6-1, believe it or not, in the winter. 6-1 losses in favor of the Germans, which I think then again puts a different spin on our winter campaign. I shouldn't be trying to jump ahead like that. We could still be talking a lot more about Kiev and Typhoon. But you know,
David, let me come in there and add there, because again, one of the major aspects in this, in terms of the Germans' success, is not how good they were, but how bad Soviet leadership was at the very top. Not necessarily people like Timoshenko or particularly Zhukov, but in terms of Stalin's interference and making decisions that put Soviet forces in a very desperate position. In fact, I think if you could argue that Stalin, if he had followed intelligent military advice, would have defended at the old Soviet borders and made the Germans push through and then run into this massive force. The problem was, of course, the political one, that Stalin never wanted to give any ground up because he was afraid that the locals would switch sides. But the level of leadership, and what you mentioned, the winter thing, the Zhukov quote in his memoirs that was taken out, was that if they had concentrated on destroying 1 or 2 of the German armies in Army Group Center, they would have gotten that and won a major victory, and maybe, in fact, then opened up the whole Army Group Center to destruction. But Stalin's emphasis on attacking everything, everywhere, was a catastrophe, both in terms of number of losses and what could have been gained was not.
Absolutely. Such a good point. I mean, there's so many examples of that. Even if we take that Battle of Kiev, I mean, it's often described as this great German victory. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to take anything away from the fact that they clearly destroyed 4.5 Soviet armies. But we have to understand, why does that take place? And Zhukov is fired as the chief of the Army's the Soviet General Staff in late July because he's advocating evacuating Kiev. Now, Kiev's kind of at the apex of a big bulge that the Germans have swept through at the south. You can see it wonderfully there, along the Dnieper River. And so they have this sort of, they've anchored their position along a major bend in the river. And you can see Army Group Center has driven well ahead of the actual other armies. It's taken Army Group South longer to get along that Dnieper River. And they haven't really connected the two. And the reason for that is, you can't really see it on these maps, but there's something called the Pripyat Marshes. So it's a kind of a no-go zone for motorized units, largely. But you can see how this potential pocket is forming. And Zhukov sees this. Other commanders see it. These army commanders in the Soviet Southwestern Front down there, they're very nervous about this. They're aware what happens if they break through from the north and were to link up with some kind of breakthrough from the south. That's exactly what's going to happen. But of course, Stalin will not allow the great city of Kiev, not to mention the eastern part of the Ukraine, which is important for all the resources it has, mines and so on, but not to mention the breadbasket of the Ukraine itself. He doesn't want to let that go. And they, do things which I think in an ideological state, Stalin is, and Hitler is sort of enamored with these ideas as well. They form something called the Central Front. And there it is on the map, the Central Front. And they give it a couple of divisions that are burned out, and that's supposed to stop Guderian. Guderian is also very weak, as we've established. He has not got the number of forces that he had at the beginning. So, he's operating with less than half of the nominal strength of those divisions and motorized divisions. He drives south, but he's driving south into very weak resistance. And of course, then he'll be able to be met by Kleist, who's driving up from the south, and they do lock up this Soviet Southwestern Front, which leads to a calamity for the Soviets. But actually, when you're following this operation in the divisions, what's really interesting is they are straining to finally link up. And I remember it's Model's 3rd Panzer Division that get to whatever position on the map that they get to. And then they realize, well, we've still got to go, I don't remember how far it is, but we've still got to go another 40, 50 kilometers to get to this final town to link up with the Southern Panzer Group. And it's literally a bunch of guys in a handful of vehicles who drive down there and finally take this. And then one of the reports in the German files is, yep, okay, we've finally made the link, which, is what we want. But then there's going to be this huge avalanche of Soviet forces falling back eastward in all kinds of chaos. And they're going to hit these German units. And one of the interesting things about why is there attrition in the Panzer and motorized groups is in the Battle of Smolensk, in the Battle of Kiev, and in the next stage of our campaign, when they begin Typhoon at the big Battle of Vyazma, the people who are having the hardest time in crushing it, it's disproportionate losses. But where are those losses for the Germans? They are highly concentrated in the motorized and Panzer divisions because they are stretched out on these very thin areas, trying to hold back this huge tide of Soviet machinery and manpower that are fleeing these encirclements. And it's catastrophic for the Soviets. I don't want to try and present this as it's all one-sided for the Germans. But again, the standards are different. The Germans are looking to win in 1941. And because of the strategic context of this war, there is no contingency for anything else. If they end up in a high-intensity war of millions of men in the East while fighting the British Empire, and basically the United States as well, because the United States may not be in the war until 12th of December against Germany, but they're in the war economically. I mean, Lend-Lease means that American factories are scaling up. American factories are sending material to Great Britain, and that will be extended very early on in Barbarossa to the Soviet Union. Now that's going to take time to filter through, but that means time is not on Germany's side. And all of these operations can't be looked at in and of themselves. Battles don't take place in a vacuum. Campaigns don't take place in a vacuum. And if the Germans can't end this campaign, well, what are they left with? How do you end the war in the East? A war that is consuming, even in the good months for the Germans. If you asked how many Germans are killed on the Eastern Front, we have this wonderful book by Rüdiger Overmans that gives you the month-by-month breakdown of German killed in the East. In 1941, in July, so July, this is the Battle of Kiev, the Battle of Smolensk, and German driving into the East. So this is a successful period. They lose 68,000 men killed. How sustainable is that for a nation of 75 million people fighting against a country in the East that's 200 million? And yes, you could tell me the Soviets lose more in July. That's also true. But again, the starting places are not the same. They're not the same. Again, Germany's fighting a global war. So these losses are, I would say, catastrophic for Germany, especially since they're going to end up with Typhoon. Yes, another big victory at Vyazma. But Wick's point here is also really good. How do the Soviets defend against Typhoon? By packing all of their divisions up against the front. I wonder if we have a map for, are we at October now? We're not quite at October. So October 2nd is when Typhoon begins. And Soviet forces are largely protecting, hundreds of kilometers of front that Army Group Center has got, and you can see them there, all packed up against the front. How does this operational concept for the Germans work? Well, they punch through in narrow sectors, enact these encirclements. Even if the Soviets weren't aware of that earlier in the campaign, well, they should be aware of it here. But exactly Wick's point, Stalin's not allowing for the operational freedom of commanders to inform what exactly is happening strategically, because if he did, the sensible thing to do would be to screen the front, hold back larger, especially your better, more mobile elements, hold them back until you can identify where the German breakthroughs are and then counterattack those. But if you peg everything up against the front, the Germans break through quickly enough. And luckily for the Germans, in that first week of Typhoon, the weather is still holding. It's actually, in fact, one of the diaries, I think, refers to it as offensive weather, he calls it. And I thought, gosh, it really is. They've still got sun. They've still got, there's no rain yet. There's been some rain in September, but the roads have dried out. They break through and enact this big encirclement. There's actually a double encirclement. Further south is a town called Bryansk, about 100,000 encircled there. And then north of that, about 550,000. That's largely eliminated most of the Soviet forces that are protecting Moscow. But why is that? Is that because of German strength? Yeah, on one level, sure, the Germans do retain a degree of strength. We are down to, in Guderian's panzer group, about 25% operational capacity.
David,
that's not very much. Go ahead.
Let me interrupt again. And underlining what you've been arguing so far, the big helper for the German advance is the fact that Stalin has created a culture in which military commanders do not dare to tell people above them that things are going badly. Better to go down to defeat or be captured than to tell your superiors that the Germans are going through. And my favorite story about it is the fact that the only way that Stalin and the crew in Moscow knew that something was really bad occurring in terms of Typhoon was about 3 days after the offensive began. All of the communications with the Western Front had broken down. So they sent out some reconnaissance aircraft, and the first one that came back reported seeing large numbers of troop transport driving towards Tula with Nazi flags on them. And the first incident sort of reminds you of the Chinese response to the outbreak of coronavirus in early January, was to arrest the pilot as a spy or agent provocateur. And luckily, some higher people intervened, and that news got back to Stalin. By then, it was too late, because in fact, the entire Western Front had broken down into various pieces that got chopped up. But again, we're dealing with a culture that eventually the Soviets fixed that. But in terms of explaining the catastrophe of 1941, it's not German military brilliance that does it, it's idiocy on the Soviet side.
Mm. And such a good point too. I mean, if we pick up this idea that, the Soviets have been through the purges, and it's good always to know these prehistories. When you've been through a purge on the scale that they suffer in the late 1930s, and we're talking tens of thousands of officers being arrested or, tortured and all the rest of it, then you have to ask two questions. One, what does that do to the culture? Exactly Wick's point. But second of all, who are the guys who are replacing them? Who are all these people? A lot of the time they are party hacks. So they're not interested in, they don't necessarily have a good sense of how military operations are supposed to be run. But even if they do, their primary interest, like most people, is self-interest. And I don't want to be accused of anything. And we've seen in the early stage, some of the German, so these men are, they're not always confronted, but there you go, right? And that's going to have an impact on them. In fact, it's also interesting while we're talking about command culture to then think about, well, how does that work on the German side? And I don't think there's that fear. There's no fear that, oh, I'm going to be executed or the Gestapo is coming for me. At the same time, it's not to say, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, that there isn't also, though, a problem. I'm not sure if that's the point where I cut out, but so forgive me if I'm repeating myself here. But it's at this point that the Second Army, which is an army people don't tend to focus on very much, reaches and takes Kursk. And what's really interesting about that particular operation, because it's seemingly not part of the drive on Moscow, it's basically just keeping contact with Army Group South. So that Second Army is the bottom of Army Group Center. Is once they've taken Kursk, if you follow that through day by day, and I do discuss it, it's not the focus of the books, but I'm always focusing on Army Group Center. It's very clear that these guys are stretched long over the front. Oh, they're wonderfully. You can see this happening in real time. They're stretched over the front. They have taken by the 2nd of November Kursk, and they've now got their major center, because the major center for the winter, if you understand what are important things, what do you need in the winter or for the colder months, once the rains and all the rest of it's going to start, the frosts, and then followed by the full winter, you need cities. Cities are very important in the East. Not every piece of land is strategically important, but cities are everything. They are communications, they are infrastructure, they are where the rails will end, they are, warm barracks, communications, they have field hospitals, they have places where you can actually have a big hall and you can recondition your vehicles there, because you can't do it outside anymore. You need to stable your horses somewhere if you can stable them. Typically that's going to be in cities because they've got infrastructure. You need those, and that's what they very much are going to prioritize for the winter defense. The Germans are actually trying to defend cities. So they've got Kursk. You would think, okay, it's early November, this is not a priority army, and they would stay there, but they don't. The next night, the OKH, the High Command of the German Army, sends, Weichs is the name of the German Army commander. They send him new orders. What are his new orders? Strike east, take Voronezh. Voronezh is 200 kilometers further east. And what I find fascinating about that is the Second Army has one panzer division, which has got almost no tanks left in it. They're not the priority for logistics. And Voronezh in November is prohibitively far. And even Helder, writing in his diary for that day, talks about this, and I can't remember the exact formulation he uses, but it's something like, of course, these are just orders in theory, but there is nothing theoretical about ordering an army to go to, they're going to set out the next day. Sure enough, they do. I can probably tell you how this ends, and you can guess it. They're never going to get anywhere near Voronezh. So the map is, this is wonderful what Jim's able to do there. Normally I don't have someone illustrating this so well, but they'll never get there. They won't even get a fraction of the distance. And we shouldn't be surprised at that. What I think we should be surprised at is, how does Weichs react? Does he send an order back saying, absolutely unacceptable? What are you talking about? Do the corps commanders do that? Do the divisional commanders do that? In fact, I have a letter, or is it a diary, of an average German soldier who's brought to his roll call in the morning, and he's explained, he actually gets the news, we're heading out to Voronezh, and he happens to know how far that is. And he says, he writes, all you can do in the German army is laugh at our own misfortune, at how absurd everything is. Sometimes I think that level says so much more than just normally what an individual soldier would have any kind of perspective on, because he's just sitting there and saying, that's just so far from what's possible. Why aren't we seeing that at a different level, when those commanders, who must be looking at the hard numbers that I am, because it's all there in their files, this is not an operation you're going to be able to pursue. And yet, why do they also not push back on this? And I think Wick's earlier point, we cannot emphasize strongly enough the primacy of will in a national socialist state. If you ever wonder, what does Hitler do when he gets up and he gives these very long speeches? What does he actually talk about? Well, he talks about himself. And he did this, and he brought them through this, and he. He doesn't ever say, well, it's very fortuitous for Germany that we had this Great Depression, because that really feeds populist propaganda that tells none of this. It's all about the strength of will, the primacy of will. And he often says, if we have a nation full of tens of millions of people with the same will, there's no limit to what we can achieve. But that therefore informs as a German commander, because these ideas seemingly have a root in German history. You know, if you go to 19th century German military thinking and military culture, they talk about things called Kampfgeist, or Siegeswille, so fighting spirit, or the will for victory. They aren't completely foreign concepts. What I think we see as a difference is by 1941, this stuff is on steroids. This is National Socialist hubris. This is, you know, gargantuan thinking. But to the German commanders, even the older ones, this isn't new thinking, but the difference between, again, the available resources and what you're seeking to do with them has grown so far. I'm just not sure to what extent they see it, or they do see it, but hey, if you say, Mein Führer, that's impossible, it can't be done. Well, there's a famous quote from Hitler that says, for the German soldier, nothing is impossible. So what is your chances of becoming...
David, let me interrupt again.
Yep.
I think to underline your point is in mid-September, when the Kiev pocket is being closed off, very clearly the senior logistics officers, as the planning began for Typhoon, indicated a very stark choice, which they would bring up again when Typhoon, in mid-October, when the entrapment of the Soviet forces took place, which was, you have two choices. And oftentimes in war, there are two choices. Both represent difficulties. The first is, we can either stay where we are and bring up the winter clothes and the supplies we need to build up dumps of fuel and ammunition for a winter campaign, or we can do nothing in terms of preparing our forces for the winter, but we will bring up the fuel and the ammunition so that Typhoon can go forward. This is never presented to Hitler. This is not Hitler's choice. This is the Army senior leadership, Brauchitsch and Halder and Bach and the rest of them, saying, forget the winter clothing, forget the the preparations for winter, forget the ammunition dumps and fuel and food. We'll go for Moscow with what we have. And it is so when it was all over and they started wringing their hands about the fact that it snowed and got cold in the winter, they'd been confronted that choice, and they had made the choice, and they basically created a situation which is, again, as I said earlier, and you agreed with me, if Stalin had been halfway smart, Army Group Center most of it would have gone down the drain.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think one of my students said it to me at one point. He said, David, it seems from everything you say that it was less about who made the right decisions and maybe more about who made less bad decisions in all of this. Yeah. And I think there's something to that. You know, perhaps the other thing is there's this second stage to the Typhoon operation. So if you imagine the first stage is basically October, there's that big encirclement at Vyazma, and then there's an attempt to exploit. So they are driving further east. Basically, maybe for a bit of context, Typhoon is trying to cover about 300 kilometers from where their starting off points are to nominally where Moscow is. The first 100 kilometers is this Battle of Vyazma. And then there's another about 100 kilometers in the exploitation phase. Now, you might ask the question, well, if they've enacted another great encirclement, destroyed, you know, this double encirclement, Vyazma, Bryansk, you know, they've largely annihilated a large part of the covering force for Moscow. How come they never actually get there? And it's because two things. The classic answer would be, well, the Rasputitsa, this time of no roads, as the Russians say, is coming into effect, where the rains start, and that turns this very sort of shallow ground into something approaching a morass. And that, of course, is going to impact your logistics as well as your movement. We kind of think tanks can move in this, but again, tanks aren't entities in and of themselves. They require infantry, they require guns, they require the fuel. They have to operate in coordination with the wheeled vehicles that support them. The other advantage, though, beyond just the mud, is the fact that once that hits, the armies are only really able to advance on roads. Roads aren't perfect, and roads sometimes do have drains on the sides of them, so there is a bit of drainage for them. That's the best, largely, that they can manage, the Germans. And so it's to the Soviet advantage that they can defend a number of key cities that are on the western approaches to Moscow. So Moskhaevsk, Volokholamsk, Kaluga, and there's another one I can't remember off the top of my head. But they're defending these places, and this is about the 100 kilometers from Moscow extent of the German advance. And ultimately, what will happen is the German forces are so weak at the front that they've largely constructed their advance over what they call kind of flying columns. They basically realize that moving these entire divisions with the lacking logistics and the difficulty of movement means we really can't continue. So what we'll have to do is we'll just leave large portions of our divisions behind. We'll construct an elite, like Kampfgruppe, a battle group as they call it, and we'll just drive ahead with those. So what you actually have fighting on those key Soviet cities that are defending is a very narrow front. It's not necessarily north-south that the Soviets are having to hold the whole front. They're just able to defend these key towns because going overland is prohibitive for the Germans, and you've got very light forces that are actually attacking them. So Army Group Center holds the advance at the end of October. And then you have stagnation. Basically what they're doing, exactly as Wick said, is they're waiting for the frosts to come. They recognize you just can't move over this ground. And we need the supplies, and we need to move more forces further east. And if supply is a real bottleneck for you, what are you prioritizing in a campaign that's supposed to get Moscow and end the campaign? This is illusional thinking, but they're not prioritizing heavy, bulky, winter clothing, which they actually don't have anywhere near enough of anyway. They're prioritizing ammunition and fuel to keep the thing moving. You can probably see where this is leading as we are now freezing the German army. At the end of October, it's only going to get colder. That's what the Germans are actually hoping for to facilitate their advance. They won't move again for another 2 weeks. Well, actually, I think they start on the 16th of November, so slightly more. And yes, the frosts then do facilitate more movement. They've done two other things. That delay has allowed more Soviet reserves to be moved up. And again, if the Soviet army is growing in size, the Soviets are building more reserve armies, and as the Germans have pushed forward, yeah, those infantry divisions, those panzer divisions are being degraded further and further. When Typhoon, what I call sort of Typhoon ×2, begins again, there is none of what we've seen previously. There is no big operational breakthrough. They don't have the strength to do that anymore. And it's not because the ground isn't hard. It's because they literally just don't have the strength to do it. They can't break through the Soviet front. So it becomes a grinding frontal assault, pushing back these Soviet armies. And these maps, I think, are constructed by the Germans. You can see it's got German writing on.
Just for everyone's information, these maps are part of an atlas that was supplied, that was actually published in a few places in Germany at the beginning of 1942. And the Ally, we captured a copy of it, and you can find this in the Library of Congress.
Jim, I know the provenance of it. It wasn't published. The Army drew it up, and it was in the Army records, which were captured by us at the end of the Second World War. And actually, there were 3 or 4 copies, because my ROTC instructor, the 2 years that I was in the Army ROTC at Yale, had a copy of it.
Yeah, I'll be putting out a copy for a whole bunch of people sometime during the summer for scholars to use. And the problem with this is it's, well, and it's also its benefit. It shows you what the Germans knew on any particular day, because these are copies of OKW, OKH maps. And so you see something about Moscow where there's like 3 or 4 divisions in front of it. And then you'll go 5 days later and there'll be several army groups as the Germans learn more and more about what was in front of them. So it gives you a very good idea of what the Germans knew, but it may not actually reflect 100% accuracy.
And that's such a key point, that
that's
if
what's
you
so good
don't
about,
have,
David, that's what's so good about your maps, which again, people should buy if they're interested in Barbarossa, the book, that is, not the map. The maps in there give a very clear indication of what's going on the Soviet side. And what's fascinating is you suddenly look about the 10th of July and you see these big globs appearing in the east, headed towards the front. And what you got, of course, is the massive German intelligence failure that finally, when Kinzel finally tells Halder, hey, they got a couple hundred of these suckers more, and Halder just sort of bemoans in his diary. But again, I think one of the great things about your book is that Halder, who got a huge reputation because he ran the German Army veterans, U.S. Army studies in the period from 47 to 51 or 52. And so they were all very pro-Halder. Halder was a catastrophe for the Germans, not quite on the order of Hitler, but in terms of the German army, just not quite.
Yeah, definitely. The thing I also like about seeing these German maps is, is what's not there is, looking at the map that we're looking at right now, you don't see that there are reserve Soviet armies forming up behind Moscow. And that's so important because, again, if we're trying to understand, how did the Germans conceive this campaign? One of the things that informs a lot of senior German commanders is the Battle of the Marne in 1914, because the ethos, or the idea of what that campaign is, they halted. If only they'd pushed on, the last battalion could have decided that. And that was the sort of, it's illusional, but that was the missed opportunity for the Marne in their minds. So when they come to these kinds of campaigns, now we're not going to miss, like we did Paris back then and miss the opportunity to end it. We're going to throw in that last battalion and we are going to drive to Moscow. So they are burning out. They're getting a lot of reports. You look at the Corps and divisional diaries in November, these guys are exhausted and they're basically asking their commander, should we continue this? It's a frontal advance. We haven't got much operational capacity at all left. I mean, most of the division is strung out over 200 kilometers. The horses are dying in the cold. We've got all these problems and we're still trying to attack, which means whatever we have left is being lost as we try and gather, the daily numbers are like we took another 5 kilometers today, another 7 today. This grinding advance.
David, let me interrupt again, because it's, again, one of those fascinating elements that you just raised about bad military history influencing people to make even worse mistakes later on, is the whole idea that that the Germans, if they had taken Paris and not retreated at the Marne, they would have won the First World War. Well, given the military situation, Colonel Hutch was completely right to pull them back, because you have Kluck's army group facing west, Buello's army group facing east, about a 75 kilometer gap between the two with one cavalry division, the British BEF wandering into the middle of that, and both German armies are outnumbered and almost out of ammunition. If they'd stayed and fought there, they would not have gotten Paris. The war would have been over in 1915 or something like that. But what explains this crazy push in the face of reality in late November, early December 1941 is the belief that this is just like Paris. This time we'll push on and take it. And of course, once we've taken it, we'll win the war. They would have gotten to the suburbs, been involved in a huge fight, nasty fight that they had were to be in Stalingrad, never taken Moscow. And then my guess is, of course, the further east they went, the worse the catastrophe was going to be, given the conditions of winter and the breakdown of their supply lines.
And keeping in mind that as they continue eastward, that expanding funnel of Russia means whatever you have in your divisions, which are already burnt out, is being stretched and stretched to cover the front. So your National Socialist military thinking that says offensive, 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 you know, come on, guys, we've got to keep attacking. This is the way to victory. You're sort of actually one of the divisions in early July 1941. This is such a great quote. If you remember nothing else about Barbarossa, maybe you remember this. It comes from a divisional commander, I think his name's Toma. He basically says, we have to be careful. This is early July. This is long before the real attrition has set in. He says, we have to be careful. The more we attack like this, we might end up winning ourselves to death. So that's just a wonderful image I have for that's what the Germans are doing here. And it's why we have to be careful that we don't just assume, hey, the classic military indicator, who's attacking, who's got the initiative, means they're sort of winning. Yeah, it's not that simple. Land isn't always valuable, and just seizing more of it can actually, it's extending your lines, and it's extending your rear lines, your lateral communications, and it's extending your the breadth of your armies. So I mean, this is a real problem for the Germans in terms of not just what they're trying to do, are they going to reach Moscow, but if you were a German commander with the clairvoyance to recognize, hey, we crushed them at Minsk and they reformed their front. We crushed them at Smolensk and they reformed their front. We crushed them at Kiev and they reformed the front between Army Group Center. They still have a cohesive front. They found the reserves. Then we crushed them again at Vyazma. What are the chances that these guys are still raising reserves and they might hit us again in the winter? Just because our intelligence, which has proven so poor anyway, doesn't necessarily pick them up. Because if that happens and we are overextended with very, very limited, not just in terms of the numbers of men in the divisions, but no winter equipment, which is not just the guys might be cold, but you know, how do the machine guns function when they haven't got antifreeze? A lot of these problems are going to hit the German army and they have no idea it's coming. So literally when they've halted the offensive on the 5th of December and the Soviet offensive doesn't begin immediately, like it does actually begin, the first attacks are on the evening of the 5th and then on the 6th there's more, but actually it takes time for those Soviet forces to get up to the front. So the offensive is a rolling one. The Germans don't realize one day to the next just how many problems they have. This is going to build over the next sort of 2 weeks to the point where the Germans are thinking two things. One, where did all these forces come from? The fact that they're even shocked by this, on some level, you could say, how is their ability to learn, or how slow is this ability to learn? In some ways, the question should be, how surprised are you? The Soviets, it is a big country. They have a mobilization base, and they've proven time and again that the one thing the Soviets can do in 1941 is force generation. Now, we need to be a little bit careful in the winter that we don't then, and I know this is probably sounding to some of you like, wow, you guys are very critical of the German army, and deservedly so. At the same time, offensive operations are very difficult. If you have a basic army that's not very well trained and has terrible staff work and all kinds of problems, it's easier to take that army, put the guys in the trenches and say, shoot at anything that comes toward you. And that might work quite well, especially when the offensive army has become a lot less offensive. They haven't got the motorized abilities that they had earlier in the year. And the topography is also helping you in the deep snow and so on. But that becomes very problematic for the Soviets. And this speaks to my earlier point. Why is that attrition rate so bad for the Soviets in the winter? Why is it 6-1 losses? Because they're moving over to the offensive with largely poor staff work, with less heavy equipment than the later Soviet armies will have. So they're not resourcing these attacks particularly well. They do have a lot of artillery, but they don't have many tanks at all. And even if they have the artillery, they've got two problems. Without the staff work, you can have the stuff, but you can't coordinate it and marshal it well. And two, once you've deluged the German front with a whole bunch of shells, even if you can coordinate that and manage it, you've got the shells and you've got all that coordinated well, okay, so you've blasted the German front. The Germans start to realize, well, don't occupy the front line. or at least if the shells start rolling in and it looks like from local intelligence, we're going to get hit with overwhelming force, the Germans are able to, at least initially, enact a flexible form of defense. And they've still got...
David, again, I think the crucial element, which I referred to earlier, and I know your most recent book emphasizes this, is Zhukov understood that right from the very beginning, and Stalin wouldn't listen. That again, as I said, a rather limited offensive of 1 million men, which is a lot of people, just aimed at the couple armies in front of Moscow, would have probably put at least one, if not two, German armies in the bag, simply because of being overwhelmed. But Stalin wanted to do it everywhere, and they didn't do it everywhere.
Yep. You know, it also speaks to your earlier point too, Wick, that, you know, it took decades. I mean, in the Soviet system, you know, Zhukov wrote a version of his memoir where he basically says the whole winter campaign from the Soviet side was a Pyrrhic victory because the costs were so huge and the amount of ground seized simply made the road to Berlin longer because we lost 1.6 million men in 3 months. And we didn't take that much. And the most important things that they don't take in the winter is not just ground, is particularly cities. So Kursk and Orel and Bryansk and Vyazma and Rezhev in the north, these are the towns they're going for. These are the anchors on which Army Group Center is dependent, and they do hold them. And the Soviets, of course, couldn't agree to that. And I think that goes to your earlier point when we were talking about, you know, bad history informs bad decisions, which is why, you know, and I probably don't need to make this because I'm sure you are all, your students as well are aware of this, why we can't be, we can't afford to be self-deceptive in our analysis of history. We have to be very, sometimes brutally honest. In fact, I'll give you an example. We have a guy teaching, a really fine historian at our Defence Force Academy, who does a course on Australian military history. And a lot of our guys come at this with like, wow, this is great. I want to study Australian military history. And Craig Stockings, who's actually our official historian for Iraq, Afghanistan, and East Timor, he doesn't sugarcoat this. Australia makes mistakes, and he says it. And some of the students come away and say, why do you have to be so anti-Australia? And the point there, and I'm sure you can all get it in this context, is, guys, we can't afford to blur that line. Just because we would like Australia to do well doesn't mean we always did. And we need to be very brutally honest with ourselves where we could have done things better. And we can't afford, in a sense, especially for training, you know, cadet officers, to indulge these ideas, because there's a lot of military history that's written that does indulge these ideas, that knows its readership don't want to read a negative story. So they give them a positive story, and it's all positive. But to what extent does that then allow you to consume a narrative other than the one that is realistic? I would say quite large. And I think that's why we need to be, both for the Soviets and the Germans, but for our own national histories, you know, brutally honest with this stuff. So yeah, we have this winter campaign that then has shifted, right? And I would say the key thing here, if I could make a sort of summative comment on the whole winter, is that the standard has changed. I don't want to go into my books and my theses and so on, but if I had to subsume them all into one, I have basically 4 books that cover that offensive period. So the 5.5 months of Barbarossa to Typhoon. And people who, you know, write about me on the internet and, you know, whatever they want to say, I don't follow a lot of that, but I know enough to know that people sometimes say, oh, he's so anti-German. All I'm doing is saying, okay, what is the German strategic goal versus what does their resources, and talking about that huge shortfall and illustrating that. In the winter, that changes because the German strategic goal changes. On the 8th of December, Hitler has a new war directive. And that war directive does 2 things for Army Group Center. It basically says, we are on now the defensive, and it illustrates what that means. It's talking about holding these population centers. If we put the whole of the winter into, you know, a nutshell and say, well, what do the Germans achieve strategically? Yeah, they don't try to hold every element of the Eastern Front, but they do try to hold those cities. And over the course of the winter, they will do it. So do they finally have operations that achieve their strategic goal? much more so. I'm not saying that this is wonderful for the Germans because they're in a war they're never supposed to be in, and there is still a huge number of losses. It's 262,000 men they're going to lose in the winter. Germany cannot afford that. So it's catastrophic on one level as well. At the same time, do they finally achieve what they set out to do for this period of the war? The answer is actually yes. And again, if this is an attritional war as of the summer, which is what I argue it is, then numbers matter. And if numbers matter, 1.6 million Soviet casualties in this period is, as Zhukov says himself, this is not worth the hundreds of kilometers we seized in various areas, but we don't get the key, we're not destroying German armies, which is what Soviet plans as of January start explicitly mentioning. Soviet plans don't achieve their strategic goals. They talk about destroying Army Group Center. Well, of course, that never happens. There are 6 armies in Army Group Center by the 1st of January. They promote some of the panzer groups to armies. Do they destroy or encircle any of those armies? Nope. Do they get any of the corps? No. Do they destroy or encircle any of the divisions? There are a number of divisions that are encircled, but they do break back into the German lines. That's not to say they don't lose a lot of equipment and have real crises. But one of the things I would say overall is the narrative of the winter from a German perspective is 2 things. One, the 2 most recent books written on this, Michael Jones and Forchek, I can't remember his first name, Robert Forchek, I think his name is. They both have the same subtitle. They say, whatever the key title is, The Retreat, Hitler's First Defeat. Well, the only point I would make there is, if this is Hitler's first defeat in the winter, and they're saying that because, yeah, the Germans are now on the retreat, I get it. But that would also mean, by implication, that Barbarossa was some kind of success, or at least wasn't a defeat. We have to understand the success or failure, not just based on who has the best tallies of destroyed tanks or whatever your standard is, but rather what are the strategic plans and to what extent do you achieve them? And by that standard, the Germans are achieving their strategic goal for the winter. It doesn't change the strategic situation they're in, but they're trying to hold the Eastern Front, and they are going to hold it. They're not going to suffer the collapse of Army Group Center. They don't have an 1812. And conversely, the Soviets are trying to do that. Their plans as of January, not initially. Initially, they're just pushing back the German spearheads, especially north of Moscow. And they do successfully do that. But then the hubris kicks in. Then Stalin's, we're going to launch these offensives, and not even just against Army Group Center. He's spreading his forces across the Eastern Front. And if you're thinking, well, wouldn't it make sense to concentrate them? Yes, absolutely it would. But such is the problematic nature of this Soviet command that they attempt too much. And
David,
as a result, yeah, go ahead.
David, let me break in a second, because I think you've raised, in terms of your subtext, absolute crucial point. Military historians spend huge amounts of time looking for decisive victories. If they can't find decisive victories, then they wander around the landscape looking for brilliant victories. And if you look at the German campaign from in terms of the Barbarossa from 22 June to 5 December, you're looking at a whole bunch of, quote, impressive victories. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, Bryansk, Vyazma, awesomely impressive. But that misses the whole reality of war in the 20th century, which is about industrial production, ability to reconstitute units, ability to, if you will, stand the long haul. And in every respect, of course, what happens in the 1941 campaign is a long-term strategic defeat for Germany, which is, in fact, to a great extent, doing what the Somme did to the Germans in World War I. It breaks the Wehrmacht in terms of its superb training, frontline, sharp-end capabilities in 1940. And so in that sense, Barbarossa is a disaster for the Germans, because they'll never be as good. And in fact, the strategic correlation of forces from this point on, particularly the economic correlation of forces with Hitler's declaration of war, makes it impossible. I can see no way that the Germans could have won except for one, which has just been raised by Frank's book on the Japanese effort from 1937 to 1942. And what Frank suggests towards the end of the book, and I think he's right, is that if the Japanese had not invaded China in May of 1937, but had been intelligent enough to stand on the sidelines of Manchuria and not do anything, with an army of 50 plus divisions, very clearly with no war in China, the Japanese would have jumped right away into invading the Soviet Far East. How they would have done militarily is open to big question, but the crucial point is that 75% of Lend-Lease went through Vladivostok, 25% through Iran, and until the end of 1942, virtually none went through Iran and Persia. And so basically what that strategic situation would have created, and his argument is that no matter how incompetent the Chinese might have been, by continuing the fight in China against the Japanese from 37 to 41, they made it impossible for the Japanese military to really think about invading the Soviet Union. And consequently, the Soviet success in World War II depended on that as much as anything else. I think it's a very good point.
I think it's one of the things I love about military history, and I'm sure many of the students are probably the same, is both these sort of formal discussions, the what happened, because we're always discovering things in that space. People think that we know it all, but I think, you know, research is constantly turning up those new information. But is also this wonderful ability, especially at the pub after the lesson, to engage in exactly this, the what if of history. What if Hitler had pursued a Mediterranean strategy? What if the Japanese hadn't, had the war in China and indeed had conserved their effort and built up their forces, and then, in 1941 perhaps invaded the Soviet Union from the east? All kinds of really interesting options.
David, all right, we have reached 7:38. You pretty much finished Barbarossa at 7:33, right on schedule. I just want to point out one thing. Your map there is December 6th. That's when the Germans stopped that publication of maps. I guess they only wanted to remember the good times. And we're only 5 days away from probably Hitler's third great strategic mistake, one being submarines, two turning east before England was done, and third, with everything going wrong, he gratuitously declares war on the United States on December 11th, which made it very much simpler for Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor to focus his main attention on Germany. But at this point, everyone's on you've been on your.
Jim, let me add one more. I want to add one more point here on your comment, which is the 11th December declaration of war. When the news came into Wolfschanze in East Prussia on December 8th, Hitler had his staff pull out champagne bottles and celebrate Japan coming into the war. His entire military staff, and halfway through their drinking champagne, Hitler said, "And where is Pearl Harbor?" And not a single Luftwaffe, Army, or Air Force officer knew where Pearl Harbor was. These were people who were planning to conquer the world, and they didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was. I think that sums it up.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's an interesting story. Any questions for our host, for Wick Murray or myself, or all of us?
Come on, guys, we got nearly 60 people on.
Hey, I'll go. This is Kurt, Jim. This is a question for David. In your book, you highlighted it wasn't just the Germans that thought they could beat the Russians in 6 weeks. You highlighted that the Americans assessed that they would do it in 4 to 6 weeks, and the British would assess the same, and so did the Japanese. So how did virtually all of the professionally trained military staffs completely underestimate the Russians?
I think there's a lot of history in that. I'm not so sure. I haven't seen the files myself. There's a recent book that has charted British and American intelligence vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But if you just look at, anecdotally, what was the prehistory to this? I mean, we've had a First World War where the Eastern Front was broken by the Germans with an active Western Front. That seems to tell people something. What happened after that? The Soviets end up, or the Russian state ends up in a great civil war. There's also terrible famine. Then there's collectivization in the 1930s and all this, disaffection with Stalin's rule in places like the Ukraine. The German Wehrmacht in 1941 is greeted as a liberating force by numerous towns and principalities, numerous towns and regions in the south. And that same is happening in the Baltic states, because the Baltic states have only been occupied in 1940. How does the Red Army do in the Spanish Civil War? Well, there's not many of them there, but they don't succeed in propping up the government. And even in the Soviet campaign against Poland in 1939, the Soviets invade on the 17th of September. It's not just Germany who invades Poland, it's the Soviets who are taking, and they have difficulty reaching their objectives because they're running out of fuel. And then, of course, there's the Winter War as well. The Winter War against the Finns. None of this tends to cast the Red Army in a positive light. Nobody sits there and thinks, well, the Red Army, that's this great force. Now, that's the difference between an anecdotal, a big broad picture look at the Red Army versus what we should be seeing in the German General Staff, because those guys aren't just sitting around making, basic conclusions. Those guys are there with numbers. They're supposed to be getting intelligence. Well, we've already discovered their intelligence is extremely poor. But at the same time, there are also reports that we have that should have cast their operational plans in a very different light. That talk about the fact that industry has been built. I can't remember the exact percentage, and I don't want to say off the top of my head,
40%.
but a significant
40%.
proportion. 40%.
40% is what they are.
You can see Wick has read my book more recently than I have. 40% of Soviet industry, heavy industry. Klaus Meyer, is it? Okay. Is being built east of Moscow. So this is beyond, that's 900 kilometers from the German start line. The Germans are never going to push to what they call the AA line, which is nominally their end point of the advance. But even if they did, this huge amount of Soviet industry is built east of this line. So, there is all kinds of problems in the German staff work that don't take account of the reality that they're going to be confronted with. And even beyond just that Soviet side, if you do say, well, they can't know everything about the Soviets, they should know absolutely the points again that we've been making. How is your logistics going to function? How are your panzer and motorized groups, given they are so important to what you call Bewegungskrieg, war of movement? How are they going to actually move if you've got all of these attendant vehicles from around Europe? How are you going to move those guns if they're coming in at the speed of